just to make sure everything's good.
I got a notification on my phone.
Awesome. All right, it looks like we're live. So thanks for coming on. I saw your video that you did on asking atheists what it would take to believe a God exists. Like if somebody knocks on your door and says, "I'm God," what would it take? I'm going to come back. Or would you like to tell it? You tell the story.
Yeah, so I created this video as my first home video. I usually just do like street epistemology videos, and I decided to make this one about what it would take for atheists to be more confident or even convinced that any or a God exists. Doesn't necessarily have to be a particular God, but so the scenario is that if God, came to your door, knocked, and asked you to come up with some criteria to be convinced that he was actually God and he'll be back in a week. And so he comes back. And so your job is to lay out something that would convince you. And I thought it would be an interesting exercise to be open-minded about what that would look like.
And you mentioned that when you ask atheists this, they don't usually answer. So have you asked a lot of atheists this before?
Well, I haven't personally asked a lot of atheists this, but when I'm, you know, watching videos and such like that, that's typically the answer that people give. And honestly, that's something I used to give. I first heard it from Matt Dillahunty, and he kind of coined the answer that I don't know what it would take, but a God would know. Which, like, I thought it was like when I first heard it, I'm like, that's awesome. That's a great answer, because if God exists, he would know exactly what that would be, and he would have the power to do it. And so the only possibilities are that he doesn't want you to know, or he doesn't have the power, and he's not really God, or something like that. But uh, but the point is not necessarily that uh, if a God exists, he would, uh, and he wants you to know, then that it would happen, which is true. The point is, like, do we even really know what that would look like? Are we open to that? Or are we just kind of like not even entertaining the idea? And I think that's the case. I think we're not even entertaining the idea. And this is true because I had trouble coming up with something, and so I made that video to kind of shed some light on that. Because it's not like, oh, I figured it out, I know exactly what it'd be. It's more like, we haven't really thought about this. So, and I got some good feedback in the comment section of that video, basically explaining um, it, there's so many like properties about a God that we would have to break them up one by one and come up with some criteria in which to be sure that, or reasonably confident that they have that attribute, you know. So
Well, I wanted to give you my answer and hear your thoughts on it. So,
okay,
from my perspective, my whole thing is that we have to start with there has to be some way to differentiate between imaginary and what's real. And the best way to do that is testable predictions. So, if you say, I believe there's a God, and if there's a God named Yahweh or whatever, and I pray to Yahweh, and a gold brick appears in front of me every single time I pray to Yahweh, I would consider that good evidence that this Yahweh thing exists. So, in that sense, just making novel testable predictions, I think, is a good basis to say that there's something out there that exists. Like if we could say, I believe in God exists and God's going to raise me from the dead in 3 days, and then you actually raise from the dead in 3 days, that's pretty good evidence. But there's a problem with this evidence is that it doesn't show that there's nothing greater. So like if you said God was the most powerful thing or the first thing to have ever existed in the universe, and you can use this to make testable predictions like I'm going to rise from the dead in 3 days. Well, that wouldn't show it was not itself created by some greater God. So I'm happy to use testable predictions to show a lot of the properties of God. Like all the things in the Bible pretty much can be granted like 90% of it just based off novel testable predictions. If you can show Jesus rose from the dead, if you can go back in history and show archaeological evidence, then most of that stuff can be confirmed and would convince me that there is a being named Yahweh that does exist. But if you're claiming that Yahweh is the greatest possible being or the most powerful, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient being that there's nothing greater than, that part I don't think can even be supported by evidence. Like, because if you think there's an all-powerful being of which there is nothing more powerful, no matter how many universes like it creates in front of me, I can just watch it create universes. That doesn't mean that there's going to be no limit to that at some point. Like it's not going to compel me that, well, okay, this is a limitless being that has all power and there's nothing greater than that. There could always just be a greater being out there that I just don't know about. So when someone claims to have the ultimate answer that there's nothing greater than or there's nothing outside of, that part I don't think that can be supported by evidence. I don't think any evidence could ever support that kind of a claim. So go ahead.
Would it be fair to say that you're not saying this being couldn't exist? You're just saying we could never really know.
Right, exactly. So if someone's claiming there's this all-powerful thing, like, I mean, okay, well, how do you possibly justify that? There could always be something else greater than that. Like, how could you ever, what could possibly be shown to demonstrate this is the greatest possible thing to which there is nothing beyond it? Like, I could imagine no possible evidence that could ever demonstrate that. Like maybe there could be out there an unknown form of evidence that could do that, but as far as I know, there's no way to justify an ultimate belief in that sense. We can only make tentative beliefs about what we can demonstrate, and those are always going to be contingent on something. They're never going to be absolute in that sense.
So if there was a situation where God was creating universes in front of you, would you say that you would be convinced, but you could never really know for sure, or you would just not be convinced?
Well, I would be convinced there is a really powerful being that can create universes at will, and I'd be like, yes, this is impressive. I am super impressed by this, but I would never go so far to say this is the most powerful thing ever in all existence, because I don't know everything about existence. I mean, I'm willing to grant this being exists. This being can create universes. It's a really cool being, but I'm not going to go so far to say this is the most powerful being to exist anywhere in existence, because we don't know anything about everything. We don't know everything about existence. So I would never go that far.
Yeah.
I don't think we can justify that claim, but I would be happy to grant it exists. There's a heaven and a hell. There's a Jesus, all that stuff. The only claims I wouldn't be able to grant are those omni claims, that there's nothing outside of this. There's nothing more powerful than this. There's nothing more good than this. Those I couldn't claim, but everything else, totally okay with.
Could you just tack on as far as we know?
Yeah, we could definitely do that. We could say, well, as far as we know, this is the most powerful being. That's totally fine.
Because I think in the same sense, like when we talk about how we know what reality is, and do we really know the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago? Do we really know we're really in the Matrix? And so when you get to that level of skepticism, it's like you can just say, as far as we know, to our best of our knowledge. And so that's probably the same situation. But yeah, so I'd kind of like to point out how really easy it is to come up with some criteria in which we would be convinced, because when you're dealing with omni properties, it's like the limit to your test is your imagination, because they can do anything, they can know anything. So if you're not able to be convinced that they are capable of doing something, then you're just not thinking, or you're not using your imagination. You're just not wanting to be open-minded about that. And so that would probably be the main thing I'm trying to focus on that video is, you don't really need to be so defensive about it. You could just be like, if this crazy thing happened, then that's what would convince me or give me more confidence. And because it's not like it's going to happen. It's not like we're scared, like, oh no, it's going to happen, and then now I'm going to be convinced, and damn it, I'm not an atheist anymore. It's like, no, that's not really how it goes. And I've also heard basically someone said, if we do this, then we're giving, apologists some ammo. And I'm like, not really. If you don't do it, you're giving them ammo, because you're just not open, and you're not
it makes your belief unfalsifiable. Like if you don't have any way you just assume it as like a starting point and then have no way to change your belief, well, then that kind of justifies the apologist position. Well, you're just being closed-minded and not actually open to any other possibilities. And so, yeah, I would agree, that's not a good idea. You shouldn't just close it off like that. I think that we should hold theism to the same standard we hold anything to. If you provide evidence for it, then we should have a reasonable basis to conclude that we should change our belief from one to another if they can provide a sufficient amount of evidence for it. The question is, well, what is that evidence? Like the example you gave of if there's a sufficiently amazing thing that happens, well, that could always just be an unknown natural cause, right? I mean, suppose a miracle happened like right in front of me, like my entire TV just turns to a solid brick of gold. I'm like, oh, that's really cool, but I'm not sure if that would convince me of a God because it's not a testable prediction. Like if some random thing happens, even no matter how amazing it is, that random thing could be caused by anything. Why would we conclude that it was caused by a God? So that's why my criteria is testable predictions. If you say there's a God, I'm going to use that God to make this prediction, and if it happens regularly, I'm like, okay, that's good evidence. I'm happy to grant that. We're good, but I still think that those omni properties are just, I don't see any way to justify those other than like how you said, as far as we know, this is the most powerful being or something like that.
Right.
I think that is a great way to justify your belief, like saying I believe there's this being and it's the most powerful thing I know of, or as far as I know, it's the most powerful. But if you're going to go so far as the theists normally do and say this is the omni-powerful being that created everything and there's nothing before it, just by definition, like the deductive arguments they present, I think that is just way too ambitious. That it's not really a justifiable thing to do in most cases, in any case, pretty much.
Yeah, and that's the issue that apologists or believers tend to run into is because they're making these claims that they can't back up really, um, and part of the reason why we don't come up with reasons that would convince us, or I mean things that would convince us, is because we're used to this relationship where they say this is true, and we go, okay, show us the evidence, and and so I feel like atheists should try to be as generous as possible when someone says that this all powerful God exists. And I'm like, oh, okay. So how do we test that? How do we know that it's not like mostly powerful, or he can create a universe, but he can't create two? Or how do we do that? And so that in that way, it kind of gets them thinking of, oh, I can't just you're not rejecting my claim. You're just saying, how do we get there? And it's kind of like a partnership of how we establish this. And so um, in a sense, if you do this, it will get them off of their post of defending these claims that they have or they've grown up with or something like that. Uh, it kind of like, how do I describe it? You have like basically two corners making claims, saying prove it, and it's just back and forth. But if we just go, okay, so how do we go about doing that? And then now it's like not two people on opposite sides. It's just two people with different beliefs going, how do we establish this?
Yeah, I've actually that works really well, and especially in street epistemology. But when I try that on apologists, they get really upset. They don't like that at all. Like I talked with Greg Kokel in person. He was up here in Minnesota to do a apologetics conference, and he hates it when you just ask him, well, how do you get there? He's like, he wants you to present an alternative like naturalism and say, well, okay, well, how would you explain like the beginning of the universe? And you have to defend naturalism. And if naturalism can't explain it, well, then my explanation is the better explanation. That is so when you, I think you're right that it's better to take the approach that we should just say, okay, how did you justify that belief? And then apologists have the scripted response where they just say, oh, well, if my God was created, well, then that's not the God I was talking about or something like that. And they give those deductive arguments of, oh, no, my God just is the ultimate creation of everything with no justification, or just those deductive arguments that are supposedly absolute or logical or some sense. But I think most people would agree that, yeah, it's kind of hard to justify that there's an all-powerful being. But yeah, apologists hate it when you do that. They're really angry at street epistemology because it does take that approach.
In a way, that this is why Anthony Magnamosco has said that the less you know about a subject makes you uh, more effective in using SE, because you really aren't like trying to defend anything. Even if you have this impulse and you're like, oh, I want to take the what's called the red meat and try to combat them in whatever they're claiming. Um, uh, Not having any position on what they're saying really helps that process of going, okay, so how do we get there? So if you're talking to an apologist and they go, well, I'm claiming this, what are you claiming? It's like, well, no, I'm just wanting to know how you got there. So I think a good way to think about it would be like, if you're if you're in a, like you're climbing a mountain and there's like a this canyon where it splits into two paths, and they're saying go to the right. This is the best way to get where we want to go. And you go, well, how do you know that? Where's your map? Da, 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 da. And they're like, what are you saying? The left? How do you know the left is good is the best route? It's like, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying I don't really want to go deep into this canyon unless I know or have some way to distinguish which is left and right. And so, yeah, I think what you're saying about apologists is right. Is that they're stuck in that mode of, you know, battling these issues rather than figuring out how do we get there.
Yeah, I think that's a really great analogy to think about it in the way apologists do. Is that so? You're claiming we should go left for these reasons, and well, I don't know if we should go right or not, but I don't know. I don't think those are good reasons. Like that's a good way to think about it. And I also liked, I really like the Anthony Magnabosco thing of the less you know about a topic, the easier it is to talk about it. Because if you present alternatives and you know a lot about the topic and say, oh no, that's wrong, that puts people on the defensive because they want to support their ideology, and if you're saying it's wrong, it makes it harder to have a conversation. Whereas opposed to say, well, I don't really know anything about the topic, how did you come to that conclusion, please explain it to me. That's a much more elegant way to have a conversation that can lead to a lot more productive progress in the topic rather than just telling them they're wrong right off the bat. So I do, that's a really good insight from Anthony that I'm definitely like writing that down and keeping it.
Yeah, I heard that you were maybe planning on doing some SE later.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a part of the local college group, the Campus Atheists, Skeptics, and Humanists, and
Mm.
we're gonna set up like a booth to just do talking, asking atheists anything kind of a thing, and I'm gonna do like SC as a part of that.
Nice, nice. Yeah, I remember there was this moment I was talking with this guy, and he said something that a lot of apologists do when it comes to the resurrection. He said, okay, either they're lying or they're
Delusion.
delusion, or
He's
it
the
was
true.
it was Jesus and all this. I'm like, wait, I could have more options. I have more options. What if an alien was involved? What if it was a glitch in the matrix? And I just start throwing out crazy stuff. Uh, and it wasn't because I believed this or anything like that. It was for I was basically showing, okay, here's some crazy ideas that you haven't thought of. How do we eliminate these going forward? And so once you start that elimination process, uh, the I was resurrected by the Christian God kind of will go with that, as you're eliminating him. So it really goes to show that focusing on the method on how we arrive at conclusions is way more effective than going, okay, I don't agree with your conclusion, and then they go, well, what other conclusion is there? Da, 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 da. So yeah, I think you are sorry. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, the liar, lunatic, or lord thing. Elon Chess actually just posted that. I totally remember it from the C.S. Lewis's like liar, lunatic, or lord thing. I think it does cover most of the options. Like if there was an alien, that would be either the lunatic or the liar option. I think it's the lunatic option because it would just be like you've under a delusion of some kind. So I think it does cover most of the options, other than like a legend, like it was just Jesus never existed or something like the mythicist position. So I think the liar, lunatic, or lord is a pretty good description of the possible options of what Jesus was. But I would usually go with the lunatic option because if you believe you're a God, you're just kind of deluded in some sense. Though I wouldn't necessarily go as far as calling him a lunatic because you can have beliefs like that that are partially justified in some sense. Like if you believe there's a God, I don't think that would make you a lunatic. I just think it would make you culturally indoctrinated. And I kind of think if you believe you're a God, it's kind of the same kind of a thing because there's lots of people who believe they're gods all throughout society. It just seems to be a natural tick of the human mind to go to that direction in many cases. So I wouldn't call him a lunatic in that case, just deluded a little bit.
Yeah. So I think when we are discussing what it would take to, be confident that God exists, our mind naturally goes to like some power that they have. Uh, I think what's also interesting is if someone is all knowing, how would we go about um, like concluding that? And I think it would have a lot to do with you not saying anything and them telling you everything you're thinking and everything that you thought and everything that no one would know but you, sort of thing.
Yeah, well, for that was a really hard one because if a being is all knowing, how does it know it's all knowing? Because couldn't there be something it doesn't know? How does it put a bracket around all of reality and say, okay, so I know everything within the context of reality, and there's nothing outside of that? That was the Paradox of Omniscience by Wittgenstein, I think. It's in the introduction to his Tractatus, where he says, how can an all-knowing being know it's all-knowing without knowing something outside of itself? It's
because it's
really
all
yeah,
knowing.
exactly. But yeah,
um,
that's an interesting one to think about.
have you ever played StarCraft?
Yes,
Okay, so
I
my
got
favorite.
1v1 platinum and masters and teams.
Wow. Okay, what's your favorite race?
Start the Protoss.
Mine too. Okay,
Void
so
Rush.
so I used to play with my brother, and he loves the Zerg, and I would create an observer, and I would go over and check out his base all the time. I loved observers. Him not knowing what I'm seeing is just a great strategy. And he would always tell me, because like if you watch the screen, there's like little squiggles that you can see if something that's cloaked is going by. So even though it's cloaked, he said he's really good at finding my observers because he knows I always make them. And so he'd always make this claim like, "Man, I always see your observer. Every time it comes over, I see it." And I just thought to myself, how would you know if you didn't see it? You wouldn't know. Like,
Exactly.
so as far as you know, you're seeing 20% of the observers that go by, and you think it's 100%. So in the same sense, that's kind of the same concept. You don't know what you don't know.
Exactly. So how could a god, even if it was all-knowing, let's just grant, let's say there is an all-knowing being, how does it know it's all-knowing? How does it verify that claim? How does it justify its own belief that it's all-knowing?
Yeah, these omni properties really just are trouble.
Exactly. So yeah, that's why your initial question, those things are just those claims are so extraordinary to steal from Hume. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Or I forget who said that, was Hitchens or Karl Popper or somebody, or Carl Sagan, somebody like that. But those claims of an omni, that there's an absolute fundamental truth that's all powerful or all knowing or all whatever, those are just such extraordinary claims. There's no way to justify them. They're too ridiculous. You can justify things like there's a really powerful being or a really knowing being or a being who created the universe even. Those could be justified with testable predictions or evidence of some kind. But claiming to have an all-powerful being who created everything and there was nothing before it is just such an unreasonable claim that I don't think anyone should ever believe that under any circumstances. You can grant it like how you said of saying this is the most powerful being as far as we know, but to actually believe there is the alpha and the omega like it says in the Bible, I think that's just not something we should ever grant with any kind of grounds of knowledge that humans have. I don't think that's something we should ever accept as a reasonable belief.
I think the best response to that, and it's not necessarily a good one, but the one that comes to mind is, well, it's limited by our understanding. Um, and we may not be able to come up with something to demonstrate an all powerful being exists, but that's because we lack the imagination or we lack the ability to do that. Um, and it kind of just sweeps the rug underneath you because if we're not able to, then, we can't tell either way. And so it basically just puts us back at being humble of our, position of human beings where we just can't do these things. So we shouldn't believe it. But it does. I think that answer kind of like it just shows that the possibility is out there. Like, I don't know. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah,
Like,
absolutely. I wouldn't say that because we have no way to verify it, therefore it can't exist. I wouldn't go that far. But I
yeah,
would say that because we have no way to verify it, that it's not really reasonable to believe it's justified. Like you can't say, I believe there's an all powerful being and it's a reasonable belief, because for it to be reasonable, there has to be some reason behind the belief that justifies it. There has to be some kind of an evidence to say, yes, this is the all powerful being and there is nothing before it. But
yeah,
how could you possibly ever demonstrate that? I don't think that's a thing that human knowledge allows us to do. So I don't think it can ever be a justified belief. I think you can believe it on faith. Like if you want to just say, okay, I believe that there's an all-powerful being who created everything and there's nothing before it, and it's just purely based on faith. I can be like, okay, that's a cool belief. I can grant that. I just don't see any reason to justify it, and that's perfectly fine. Like that was my conversation with Pete Inns. He kind of takes that position that there's not, the apologetics arguments don't really work. He believes based off of faith and accepting scripture, and I'm totally okay with that. I think that's a reasonable belief. If you just accept it, doesn't have any supporting evidence, it's just a belief that you have not based off evidence, well, that's totally fine. There's no inconsistency there. So like, I can believe I am the smartest person in the universe, even if it's not based off any evidence. As long as I don't claim it's based off evidence, it's totally fine to believe that. But as soon as you start claiming, I believe this all-powerful being, and here are the reasons that justify that, I think you've gone way too far.
Yeah. There's this video that I watched like a couple years ago that kind of came to mind. I don't know if you ever saw this sort of claim, but there was like this young preacher, and he was basically explaining how out of all the things to know in the universe, what's the percentage you think that you know? And someone might go, wow, it's like probably really strong, really small, like 2%. And then it's like, okay, well, God knows all of it, so it's like way bigger than yours. So basically trying to humble you and say, you don't really know anything, so try not to take your reasoning abilities too seriously. But the problem I always found in something like that is going, well, how did I come up with my percentage? How do I know how much is out there? How can I give how can I say I have like 2% of all of knowledge if I don't know the total? Like, if there's a pizza and it's like, well, how big do you think your slice is? I don't know. Like, I don't know the size of the pizza. And so there's that same problem of like, we're limited and we don't know the total. How could we ever say how big our slice is? Have you ever heard anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of my favorite quotes is from Thomas Edison, who says, "We only know a millionth of a percent of anything." So I really love that. And the claim that apologists make that there's an all-powerful being, I mean, like, how could you possibly know there's an all-powerful being without actually yourself knowing everything? Like, if I grant I only know a millionth of a percent of anything, and you're going to claim that there's an all-powerful being who knows everything, well, how could you possibly know that without yourself knowing everything? Like, it's so you and your whatever 2% or a millionth of 1% knowledge claim to have knowledge of this all-powerful being who knows everything. That seems like a contradiction in terms, kind of, to say that with your limited knowledge you have knowledge of this absolute. It seems like a direct contradiction to say those two things.
To go back to the StarCraft example, there are things that we know we don't know. So, like, for example, when you start off a StarCraft game, you know this is the map. I only can see this. The rest is black. I don't know. And like that's the intuition when someone asks, like, out of all the things to be known, how much do you know? You kind of have an idea that you don't know shit. Like, the universe is huge. We kind of understand that it's limited by our scope, not necessarily by some parameters like a StarCraft map. Like the light is limited by our ability to detect like the wavelengths. Like, it goes as high as we can detect, it goes as low as we detect. We don't know where that ends. As far as I know, I could be wrong. I don't know. But it's like there is a distinction between we know we don't know things, and then there's just like we don't know what we don't know, and that's just who knows how big that is. But would you say that we can be confident that the whole universe, our understanding of it, is just like so small, just based off of size?
Well, I wouldn't say just based off size. I would say that we can't ever conclude that we have any solid percentage grasp of anything. So, like, we can always get smaller. Like, we thought that atoms were the smallest particle. That was back in the Greek days. We defined atom. Just the definition of atom was the smallest constituent part that wasn't made of anything. But then actually, when we looked into the physical atom that made up all of the stuff, we realized it was actually made of smaller things, protons and neutrons and electrons. And when we zoom into those, we realize that they're actually made of smaller things, of gluons. And when we look into those, we might find out that they're actually made of smaller things. So we have no reason to conclude that there is a stopping point, that we've reached the end of the discovery metric, and that we're at the edge of the map, so to speak. So as far as, I don't think we have any reason to conclude that we have any grasp on that we have some percentage that we know of the reality. I think we should only conclude that it can go on infinitely. until we find like a way to determine there is a stopping point. And until we find out, yes, here is a stopping point, and here's how we conclude what a stopping point is, I think we should always just assume that we only ever understand a millionth of a percent of anything. Because I think the greatest mistake that humans have made is concluding that, well, here's the end, there's nothing beyond this, and we're just done. I don't think that's something we could ever justifiably conclude in human knowledge, especially in like science. It's just,
Yeah. If we were to look at the universe and we found this like huge wall, and we're like, we found the edge of the universe, and look on the other side, there's edge there, and we go up and down, there's edges. Even if we do that, it's like, well, what's on the other side? We don't.
exactly.
Um, yeah, it's very interesting. So the other claim would be an all-loving property. I have no idea how you would even determine that. What does that even mean? Like,
Yeah, it's like saying there's an all tall property. Like, what? Like, is there like a tallest thing out there somewhere that is the tallness just goes on forever? Like, what does it even mean? Because lovingness is just like an adjective. Like, how can you have the greatest adjective? There's an all running thing. Like, what?
yeah, man,
What?
it runs better than any runner. So
But
I think a good question to ask if someone says something like that would be, what is the second most loving thing?
yeah,
Because then it forces them to go, okay, what's the criteria? I could, because I'm just saying all loving, it's the most. Okay, well, what's the second? Um, Crap. Now I need a criteria. Now I need a method.
that's. I think they would say that God is like the essence of love or something, like the basis of love, where all love comes from. Kind of like, um, for example, water. Hydrogen is the basis of water, and water can't be made without hydrogen. So I think they'd say God is like that in that sense, kind of like the basis of all love, and that's kind of what it means to be omnibenevolent. That
Yeah, but that doesn't really answer the question for me. It's like, is there someone that isn't as loving as God because they have the capacity to love? Does that mean that and they get it from God? Does that mean they're all loving just like God because it's all the same, or like there's a scale of love, right? Like because if you take someone who's just had a horrible life and conflicts pain on everybody, it's like, okay, he's not as loving, right? Okay, so what is the difference between all loving and the least loving, and how do we read in between? And
yes,
saying that God is the essence of it is like, okay, that is just telling us what it is, not how we scale it.
yeah, for sure. So it's a really because there's different answers there for most theists, but the one I think that most theists resonate with is just saying like God is just the source of love, and that's kind of what they mean by omnibenevolent. Not like it's some kind of a measurable metric that there's like
Oh, okay. Yeah.
so love can't exist without God, kind of that kind of claim, and that's what it means to be omnibenevolent. Just because if you're the source of all of it, then it can't exist without you, kind of a thing.
Then I guess I am omni me because without me, I can't exist.
Exactly, exactly.
Whatever that means. Let's see. Okay, so we talked about all loving, talked about all powerful, all knowing. Am I missing something?
Well, there's the like the eternal, the existing outside of space time, which is kind of an omni too.
Omni existent. Yeah.
Yeah, so I
That
think the six properties of a god are omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, personal, eternal, and conscious. So those are the three omnis are the all powerful, all knowing, all loving. And then there's the eternal, which may or may not be an omni. And then the other one is just personal and conscious.
I think eternal would be similar to omniscient because it's like, well, how do you know you existed first, and how do you know that you're not going to die eventually or not exist, or whatever you want to call it? Uh, those are just like baseless assertions.
Right. So like if assuming you believed that you existed forever, well, how do you know you weren't created by something else and it caused you to believe you existed forever, but you were actually just created? You just don't know it.
Yeah. So I guess the moral of the story is we should never say or never claim to know or you know uh, believe these omni properties because there's always just limits to them, and it's an unlimited claim.
Right. Absolutely. That's exactly my position is that you can't say that with our tentative knowledge, you know some absolute thing. There's no way to justify an absolute belief based off of our tentative knowledge.
Yeah. Cool. Now, now there's like lesser gods. Those are a lot easier. Like what it would take for me to believe Thor exists. I mean, I've watched Avengers. I have plenty of ideas. Like, okay, I see this, and he has a hammer. Okay, we just got beamed up, and now we're at what is it called? Oh man, I'm blanking.
The Asgard or the
Asgard. Yeah. Like if I was at Asgard, I'm like, hey, I know that guy. Like this is just like the movies. Like, or I mean, it could be different, but uh,
yeah,
so
and most of the claims in the Bible are the same kind of a thing. Like if there's a heaven and a hell, if I die and go to heaven or die and go to hell, I can grant heaven and hell in the same way that you could grant Thor by going to Asgard. So like most of the stuff in the Bible you could just grant in the same kind of a sense. But those omni powers are just beyond us.
that creates a great outsider test for uh,
Faith
for
outsider test for faith.
yeah. Like if you think about, well, this kid died and went to heaven, or this guy claimed he died and went to hell, and I'm like, okay, so if someone died and said they claimed they went to Asgard, is that just as good for evidence of Thor? Uh, and you can play with that a little bit, and it just demonstrates our inability to investigate when people die and go places. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, and that's kind of one of the claims they the apologists use against Thor is that, well, Thor isn't all powerful. He couldn't have created the universe because they don't claim Thor is all powerful. Well, does that mean he's not? Like, do you have to actually claim to be all powerful to actually be all powerful? Maybe all powerful is a kind of property that just is a thing without them claiming it. Maybe they are all powerful. We just don't know it or they didn't claim to be. So, what would convince you that they're all powerful even though they didn't claim it?
yeah,
And
like we weren't ready to hear it.
yeah, exactly.
Um, and I'm trying to think of other. I mean, any god that is less than all these omnis, which is kind of the point of the omnis, is easier to come up with criteria that would convince you. Um, so yeah, I think that kind of sums up um, what I was trying to express for atheists is to just not be
Be open to the possibility that you can demonstrate there is some parts of the God that exist instead of just rejecting the whole idea at its face value.
right. Yeah, yeah. What else you got?
Oh, well, how long have you been doing? Let's talk about your channel a little bit. How long have you been doing that? Doing street epistemology? How did you get into it?
I think it's a little less than 3 years, and like a lot of other SEers, I watched Anthony Magnabosco, and I was like, uh, I really enjoyed it. At first, it was kind of a thing where I was like, man, this is a great idea to get people to tell us the real reasons they think it's true, and then just destroy them. And I was like, oh, this is great. But then I realized, actually that doesn't work. Not only that, but they're being really open and honest, and that's just unethical. Why would you want to do that? And the best way is, to just kind of slowly have them think about it, and then they lead it. You're just giving them the tools, and they do the work. And so, honestly, after doing it for a while, it kind of changed my outlook on um, it changed my attitude towards believers, because before it was like online argumentation, and I was never really face to face with anyone, and um, it was always about their argument and my counter argument and stuff like that. And so, and SE has taught me basically the arguing doesn't really help that much, um, unless someone's in that right state of mind where they're putting everything on the table. But if you kindly just talk to people, they'll tell you like the real reasons, even if they're not really good reasons, and they will eventually realize them. Uh, just using SE is just a way better way of being effective and kind at the same time.
So you
So
said it's changed your view of apologists and how you talk to them. So has it like made you more compassionate, like what have you learned from street epistemology? Have you used street epistemology on your own beliefs and rethought certain things that you didn't consider before?
Um, well, I wouldn't say it changed my view on apologists, just believers. Apologists,
Yeah, that was my mistake. I usually kind of use the term to mean the same thing.
yeah. So your general believer, you just don't want to go to anti. You're in apologist mode. Sometimes with being an atheist, and you don't want to do that to just a regular believer. Um, but as far as like things that I've essayed on my own beliefs, I think that last video was kind of born from that, because like I would ask all the time, what would it take for you to be less confident, and they're just unable to come up with something, and that not able to come up with something would lead me to say, if you're not able to figure out what it would take, is it possible that, or I'm sorry, if you're not able to identify what it would look like for you to be wrong, is it possible you are just wrong and you have no idea how to identify that? So, for example, this one guy I was talking to was saying, everything is clearly designed. Look around. It's clear. It's designed. I'm like, okay, what does undesigned look like? Can you think of one thing that's undesigned? And he's like, well, no, everything is designed. And I'm like, okay, but what would it look like if it was undesigned? And he just couldn't come up with anything. And so I usually ask, is it possible that something is undesigned and you just have no idea how to identify it? Like, if undesigned was right in your face, you would have no idea, correct? And he was just like, got a little stuck. So
Yeah, I love that. Actually, the way I like to phrase it is, if there's a designed object and a non-designed object right in front of you, how do you tell the difference between the two?
right. And the usual response is, um, well, there isn't any undesigned. It's like, well, you're not really entertaining the hypothetical, because you're just showing you don't have a way to tell.
Right. So that means, but if everything is designed and you have no way to tell the difference between designed and undesigned, everything around you could be undesigned and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, right?
Yeah, you have no idea. Um, and so let's see what else is going on my channel. So I've been doing it, for a little less than 3 years. I have recently tried to create like a game where it's like, okay, you get certain points for identifying the real reason why you believe something. You get certain points for being able to test it. You get certain amount of points for all these other things that help you gain more confidence. And so basically the idea is, you give me your confidence level. We go through this game of like, uh, that I lay out beforehand and tell them, okay, it would take this and that. Uh, and then later on, we'll compare what you can actually get to versus what you told me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sort of. Do you have like the game actually like finished yet?
No, it was just an idea that I thought of, but I decided not to really use it, because it wouldn't really help someone reflect. It would basically just cause them to be more defensive, because they realize they can't get to where they need to go. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
I think it would be like they would have to already know the rules of the game and accept that they are reflective of reality or justifiable. Like, um, I use this example in historiography, is that when you talk about what makes a belief about what happened in history justifiable, and you're talking about all these different criteria that historians use to justify, was this actually written and true, most people don't know any of that stuff. They don't accept all those different methodologies that the historians use because they're way too academic and pedantic. So using those kinds of things to try and convince someone that a part of the Bible was added in later or something isn't going to work, because they don't accept that methodology beforehand as something that guides their beliefs. So in your game example, it would kind of be the same kind of a thing, is that unless they already accept all of the rules of the game are what measure a justifiable belief, they probably wouldn't accept it as a justifiable metric to conclude that their belief was not founded on good reasons or something like that. So I think that it could be a good system, but it would only cause them to reflect if they already accepted all of the rules of the game as what they thought were good ideas or good bases to justify their belief.
True. Yeah. And that's a lot of the time when SE has these things where we have these like thought exercises to basically try to illustrate a point that's not directly talking about the sensitive belief that we're talking about. And a lot of times, those thought exercises aren't really necessary because it just depends on the person. So like when we started coming up with these examples of helping people think through certain ideas, um, we would all lay them out in the beginning. We thought it was a great idea to lay them out at the beginning, and so they like are on the same page and they understand is and then when we get to their belief and they realize the mistake they're making based off of that thought exercise, it would be like a wonderful example. But usually what happens in interviews is like, okay, like we did 5 thought exercises and only one applies and it's like way later and they've already forgotten. And so it's like, why even, go about it? So I guess that's probably, maybe I should talk about the thought exercises and what they illustrate.
Sure.
So, um, one thought exercise is the Ferrari example or Ferrari thought exercise. And the idea is you ask someone what it would take for them to believe that you own a Ferrari. And they would give you some percentage from like 0 to 100. Like say, I'm about like 40%. I'm not really convinced that you have a Ferrari. And then you would slowly ask them what it would take. So like if I pulled my keychain out and it had a Ferrari symbol on it, would that convince you? And they're like, okay, it would give me a little more confidence. Okay, so if I showed you in the parking lot, would it increase your confidence? And they might add that it would. And then you get to the higher end, and you're like, okay, so what would it take for you to be 100% confidence? And usually it's like seeing the title. And so it's a great example of understanding that you need to provide evidence to get somewhere, and here's your criteria and how you do that. And so when someone has a belief that doesn't have criteria in how they got to it, like if they just say, "Well, I just have faith that it's true." Well, can we have faith that you know? Can you use faith to just be confident that I have own a Ferrari? Would that be a good way? And then the little light bulb comes on, like, oh, I can't do that. Um, let's see, what other thought exercises are there?
Actually, my response to that is the way I could be 100% certain that you owned a Ferrari is if you transferred the deed to me and I owned the Ferrari. Yeah.
Oh, that's true. But can't deeds be forged? But yeah, if it was forged, it wouldn't be able to be transferred, I guess.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. That's a good one.
And then I'd have a Ferrari. Like, yes.
Right? Uh, so another thought exercise would be um, something I made. Actually, no. First, before I go there, let's go to the Tic Tacs. You ever heard the Tic Tac analogy?
But the Ferrari one, that one was Anthony Bagnabosco's, right? I think that he came up with that one. I saw that one on his show.
I don't think he actually made it, but it was like maybe Reed read about it and then it was like added. The thing about the SE community is we just like all steal from each other and we're like, oh, that's a great idea. Let's do it. And so it's not like we kind of lose track of who did what,
Yeah.
uh, or I do maybe. But let's see, what was I talking about? Oh
The
yeah,
Tic Tac.
so the Tic Tac exercise is to help people understand what they mean by saying something is true. So when someone says this is true, and you ask them if someone disagrees with you, how do you figure out which one is correct? And they go, well, we're both correct. It's true for us. And it's like, okay, so how do we explain the idea of truth? So a good way to do that is get some Tic Tacs and ask them if the amount of Tic Tacs in there is even or odd. What do we know? It's like, okay, no, we don't know. So if would you say that it it has to be even or odd and it can't be anything else? And they would agree. Generally, they agree. I have some people that are like, oh well,
It's like a half a Tic Tac in there somewhere.
yeah, yeah. Uh, so once we establish that it has to be one or the other. It can't be both. Then you say, if I say it's even and you say it's odd, and we pop it open, count it, and determine that it's actually odd, would you say that you're correct and I'm mistaken? And I go, oh yeah, yes, I'm correct and you're mistaken. Okay, so is this belief that you're claiming, is it something that is, when you say it's true, are you saying that like it could be both true and not true, or what are you saying? And so that also helps.
Yeah, I've had some really interesting conversations where people actually try to take the relativist route and say, "Oh no, no, it's still just true for you," and just hearing them try to explain how that's the case is just absolutely hilarious.
Yeah, usually they're trying to redefine truth, and um, instead of using words, it's best to just go with what do you mean by that, you know?
Yep.
And then from there, it kind of gotten transformed to a coin toss. So if you flip a coin, put it on your hand, you don't know what it is, I don't know what it is. Um, and could it be heads and tails at the same time? No. Okay. And the idea is that neither of us know. So wouldn't the best position be that I don't know is the correct answer instead of just having to choose one? That's a good exercise as well.
And you mentioned that one that you came up with.
Oh yeah. So before I talk about it, there's a question that we ask in street epistemology, and it's the idea behind this question is for us to really understand what it is that's giving you confidence that this is true. So if someone gives us a reason, how do we know that it's, or how do both of us know that that's actually what's giving you confidence? So, for example, someone will say, I believe that God exists because, um, everything seems so, finely tuned. And then the question you would ask is, if you discovered later on that things weren't so finely tuned, or how we came to know that everything is fine tuned is flawed. If this wasn't the case, would you be less confident that a God exists? If their answer is yes, that's contributing to their confidence. If their answer is no, it's really not. That's not the reason. It's just something that they've heard and they think it's a good idea, but it doesn't really sway them either way. So I try to explain to people why I'm asking this because a lot of times it just seems like I'm trying to falsify their position because they say, well, this is the reason why. Well, what if that wasn't true? If I could just blow that out of the water, and they get kind of like a little defensive because what are you saying? This isn't true? It's like, no, I'm not really saying that's not true. I'm just saying if it wasn't, would that affect your confidence? And so I think it was helpful for me to explain why I'm asking that because I'm not trying to say it's actually not true. I'm just trying to understand if it's affecting their confidence. And so I came up with this analogy, and it's called the jambalaya analogy. So have you ever eaten jambalaya?
Yes, a few times.
Okay. So jambalaya is known for being spicy and has a ton of ingredients. And so if I went to a chef and I asked them if I would like my jambalaya less spicy, what ingredient do I need to take out so it's less spicy? And they said, well, if you take out the bell peppers are really what's causing it to be spicy. And then you follow up question, well, okay, so if I take out the bell peppers, would it be less spicy? And they say, no, it would be just as spicy. Like then I would realize that okay, the bell peppers aren't what's making it spicy. What is making it spicy? And so when I lead with that, and I kind of explain, trying to get to the root of what is making it spicy, rather than like how would we figure it out? Just taking out ingredients, and then the spiciness level would go up and down. Um, they kind of understand that I'm not saying that bell peppers don't go on jambalaya. I'm just asking how is it affecting the spiciness level, and so in the example of their belief, what is contributing to their confidence? I want to figure it out. Or another way of thinking about it is they have a pillar that's holding up their belief, or many pillars. I want to identify which one's the main pillar, which one is actually going to make it fall, and which one's not really going to affect it at all.
Right. Yeah. So I can see when you ask someone if that was not the case, would you stop believing? They kind of see that as like, oh, well, so now you're going to start attacking that belief, and I may or may not be qualified to justify it. And so you may be able to show it's not true, and then, well, that makes me look like an idiot. So I have to say, I don't know. I have to like be it puts them on the defensive right away. And so,
Right.
yeah, I can definitely understand how your jambalaya analogy will help them to understand that, well, this really isn't about me trying to show that that's false. It's just trying to find out what it is that makes you believe. Like, is this something that's integral to your belief system, or is it just something you've added on later and something that sounds nice? And trying to explain what is the core of your belief, like what's the core of the jambalaya.
Yeah, the foundational reason why it's spicy, or something like that. Um, and I find that once I explain it like that, usually I don't have a lot of time, so sometimes I don't use it. But if I feel like someone's kind of on the defensive about that question, I follow up with that, and usually they understand. And then it's more like a, oh, that's really not my real reason. I'm like, well, what's your real reason? And then I had to really think about it, and it's much more of a cordial discussion about why they believe something rather than this like show me where to attack sort of thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
So your channel is Deep Discussions,
Hmm.
and you can just Google that. Do you have the custom YouTube name where it's like youtube.com/deep discussions?
I think it is just deep discussions. I'm not sure if you Google it what it will look like, but if you go into YouTube and search deep discussions, you'll definitely find it. It's got that little head with the puzzled brain, and then you're holding up a puzzle piece looking at it. I think that was a great analogy, just trying to figure out how everything fits together, even in your own mind.
Yeah.
So that was a good picture. I went with that. Um, but I'm also on Twitter as Spaghetti Eddie. Uh, Originally, it was just deep discussions on Twitter, but then I realized I don't always want to do street epistemology, and I also don't want to like misrepresent what street epistemology is by arguing with people and under a street epistemology name. And so I was like, I'll just make it a different name, and then I could kind of feel free to do both.
Yeah, your channel's doing really well. You're about to pass me in subs too, probably in the next month.
You know what's funny? I'm not even doing anything. It's weird. Like the last time I uploaded a video was like 3 months. I'm a busy guy. I work 50 hours a week. I have two kids, and I do love doing street epistemology, but it's not one of those things where I can do all the time. And like even when I have the opportunity, it's like, oh man, I'm in Texas. It's raining. It's cold. It's hot. What have you? And so opportunities don't really come up that often. But I mean, I do love to do it.
Oh, you're in Texas? Where in Texas are you?
Tyler, Texas.
I'm about to go down in 2 weeks for a debate with Modern Day Debates. We're doing like a debate series down there. So
Oh, nice.
we're gonna be in Dallas. So
Dallas. Oh, that's a couple hours away.
yeah.
That'd be cool. Um, what else was I gonna say? Yeah. So one disadvantage I have over other SEers like is that because I'm so busy, like that 1 hour I get to go out in the park, I'm like, man, this got to count. I'm gonna get some good interviews, and then uh,
Nobody shows up.
yeah, like nobody shows up, or I mean, there's always people, but sometimes it's not a very good interview, not a very good subject, or something like that. So um, I don't necessarily get too picky about what I upload. So some of my interviews are like, weird topic, but I'd rather just put them out there you know, just to see um, any opportunities I have or anything like that.
Yeah, I actually find that's really helpful too, because the ones that you may think are not very good, some people find them really interesting or helpful because they've had similar conversations or thought about similar topics and that you really didn't think about. So like I do those on my Discord where I just have anybody come in and talk about whatever they want. And a lot of people seem to really like those kinds of conversations that you may not think are the best, but everyone else can still find them interesting or find value in them.
Yeah, there's actually something I do as well is like as I'm editing the video and I go, man, I should have asked that, or man, why am I going off in this direction? I actually like type like my thought process, like, okay, here I made a mistake. Here I should have done this. Here's a better way to ask that. Um, or if everything's going well, I'll comment on something about the person I'm interviewing like their thought process. Hey, did you notice this? They're avoiding this, or hey, did you notice how open they are here? And just kind of give people an idea of what I'm thinking about. And that way, it's not just an interview with people talking. It's also like a subtitle sort of thing, like not a subtitle, but like here, like details of how I think it went and opportunities and stuff like that.
Yeah, commentary after the video.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. I think that's been about an hour. Thanks for coming on. This was a great conversation.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm going to put your link in the description. Joy just asked for it, so I'll be sure to do that so people can find you on your YouTube channel and your Twitter.
Awesome.
Awesome. So I'm going to go get some coffee. It was great coming on. Great talking with you. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Later.